There's something terrifying about being truly seen by someone younger than you. Not admired, not idealized, seen. Because a younger person doesn't look at you the way people your age do. They haven't collected the same disappointments yet. They haven't learned how to emotionally negotiate every feeling before they express it. So when they love, it comes out raw, unfiltered, almost reckless. And maybe that's why this scares you more than you admit. Because part of you already feels it. You can pretend this video is just curiosity, something to listen to while you eat, while you scroll, while you try not to think too hard at night. But something in you paused when you read that title. Something quieter than ego, older than loneliness. If that feeling's already sitting in your chest, stay with me. And subscribe if you want more conversations like this. Not motivation, not performance, just truth people usually avoid saying out loud. Because I need to tell you something most men never hear at the right time. Sometimes the person who will love you the deepest arrives after you've already convinced yourself your most meaningful love story is behind you. And you won't recognize it immediately. You'll think they're just drawn to your stability, your experience, your calmness. You'll tell yourself they're fascinated by the idea of you. But then small things start happening. They listen too carefully. They remember things you said casually 3 weeks ago. They notice when your voice changes by half a tone. And suddenly, you're not dealing with attraction anymore. You're dealing with emotional exposure. That's different. A lot of men secretly believe they've already missed their chance at being loved in a pure way. Especially men who've been through betrayal, divorce, emotional humiliation, or just years of being emotionally useful instead of emotionally understood. You learn how to function. You become dependable, funny, controlled. You know exactly how much vulnerability is acceptable before people become uncomfortable. So when someone younger comes into your life and starts looking past all of that, it disrupts you. Not because of age, because of innocence. And I don't mean innocence in a childish way. I mean emotional courage that hasn't been crushed yet. See, younger people sometimes love with this terrifying level of sincerity. They still believe connection can mean something permanent. They still reach for your hand without calculating leverage. They still ask questions they probably shouldn't ask, like, "Who hurt you like that?" And the worst part? You usually laugh it off. But internally, it lands like a knife. Because nobody's asked you that in years. Men carry heartbreak differently. Nobody really talks about that, honestly. A woman cries in front of her friends and people gather around her emotionally. A man gets quieter. He starts optimizing his life instead of healing it. He improves his schedule, his income, his body, his discipline. But deep down, there's still a room inside him he doesn't enter anymore. And then this younger person walks in there accidentally. No fear, no hesitation. Almost like they don't realize how dangerous that room is. That's when you start pulling away a little. Not because you don't feel something, because you do, and it's stronger than what you expected. You start overthinking simple interactions. You analyze your responses before sending them. You become hyper-aware of your age, your past, your emotional damage, your exhaustion. You wonder what they could possibly see in you. But that question reveals something painful. You still think love is earned through perfection. They don't. That's why this affects you so deeply. Because they're responding to parts of you you've spent years hiding from everyone else. You know what's strange? When someone younger starts to genuinely care about you, it doesn't always feel comforting at first. It feels disorienting. Because they don't relate to you through your achievements. They don't measure you by what you've built or survived. They respond to something quieter, something you stopped paying attention to a long time ago, your presence. And that creates a kind of psychological tension inside you that's hard to explain. You start noticing yourself through their eyes. Not in a flattering way, in an honest way. Like suddenly you're aware of how often you look tired even when you're smiling. How many pauses there are in your speech when you talk about certain memories. How quickly you change the subject when something emotional gets too close. They notice those things. And instead of pulling away, they lean in. That's what unsettles you. Because most of your adult life has been built around people adjusting their distance from you based on how together you appear. You learned early that being emotionally stable was safer than being emotionally honest. So you built that version of yourself carefully, controlled reactions, measured vulnerability, a personality that doesn't demand too much from others. But this younger person, they don't respond correctly to that system. They don't reward your restraint. They respond to your humanity underneath it. And that creates confusion in your nervous system, because part of you keeps asking, what do they actually want from me? But the deeper question you avoid is, what happens if they actually see all of me and still stay? That possibility is more threatening than rejection. Rejection is familiar. You know how to survive it. You know how to rationalize it. But being chosen while fully seen, that requires a different kind of emotional courage. And I want to be careful here because this isn't about fantasy. It's not about idealizing youth or intensity. Real connection, healthy connection, doesn't depend on age. It depends on emotional maturity, timing, and mutual respect. But there is something psychologically intense that can happen when someone younger experiences their first deep emotional attachment to a person who already carries life experience in their eyes. To them, you don't feel like just a person. You feel like a story they haven't finished reading. And you can feel that energy even if it's never spoken. So you start watching yourself differently. You start questioning your boundaries, not in a healthy, reflective way, but in a quiet, internal negotiation. How much of myself is appropriate here? Am I responsible for their feelings more than my own? And that's where things get complicated. Because men who have been through emotional responsibility before, especially those who had to hold relationships together alone, tend to fall into a familiar pattern. They become caretakers again. Not always out of love, sometimes out of habit. Because being needed feels safer than being unknown. But here's the truth you might not like hearing. If someone younger is genuinely offering you love, it should never feel like emotional debt. It shouldn't feel like you owe them stability in exchange for their affection. Yet many men unconsciously step into that role. They start performing emotional safety instead of actually feeling safe. They become careful with their words, over-responsible with their tone. They start editing themselves in real time. And slowly, without noticing it, they stop being fully present. That's the danger, not the age difference itself. It's what you abandon inside yourself to maintain the dynamic. And I think part of you already senses that. That's why this connection feels both warm and unsettling at the same time. Because something in you is asking, am I being loved? Or am I being assigned a role? And underneath that question is something even more vulnerable. If I stop performing, will I still be chosen? That fear is older than this situation, but this situation is what brings it to the surface. And once it's there, you can't unsee it. There's a moment in these kinds of connections that most men don't talk about. It usually happens in silence, not during a dramatic confession, not during conflict, not even during intimacy. It happens in an ordinary pause, a pause where the younger person is just looking at you, not checking your reaction, not trying to impress you, just looking. And you feel it, that strange exposure, because in that moment, you're not being interpreted through your roles anymore, not your career, not your experience, not your ability to stay composed when things get difficult. You're just a person sitting there. And that simplicity can feel almost unbearable if you've spent years building layers of identity to feel secure. You might notice yourself becoming slightly self-conscious without knowing why, adjusting your posture, choosing your words more carefully than necessary, smiling a bit too quickly, not because you're dishonest, but because you're suddenly aware of being seen without armor. And that can create a strange internal conflict, because part of you wants to lean into it, to relax, to let yourself be understood without managing the outcome. But another part of you, the part shaped by disappointment, rejection, or emotional inconsistency, keeps warning you, don't get too comfortable. So you stay in between, half present, half guarded. And the younger person might not even notice this tension consciously, but they feel it emotionally. They feel the distance you didn't intend to create. And here's where something important happens psychologically. When someone younger attaches emotionally for the first time in a deep way, they don't just attach to who you are right now. They attach to what you represent in their emotional development. Safety, depth, stability, something they haven't fully experienced before. And that can feel very powerful, but also very fragile, because it carries expectation without intention. Not malicious expectation, just unformed emotional projection. And if you've been through life long enough, you start recognizing that pattern early. You've seen what happens when people idealize you. At first, it feels good, almost intoxicating, being understood without having to explain everything. But later, it becomes pressure, because you realize they're not just responding to you, they're responding to the emotional meaning they've placed on you. And that's a heavy thing to hold. So you start becoming cautious, not distant, just careful. And that caution can slowly reshape the connection. You begin filtering your emotional expression. You avoid certain topics that might shift the dynamic. You downplay your own needs so you don't overwhelm their perception of you. And without realizing it, you start disappearing a little inside the relationship. That's the quiet danger no one prepares you for. Not manipulation, not age, but emotional self-editing. And the irony is, the younger person usually doesn't want that version of you. They didn't fall for the controlled one. They fell for the moments where you slipped out of control, when you said something unpolished, when you admitted uncertainty, when you didn't immediately have the answer. That's the version they remember. Not because they're naive, but because emotional authenticity is rare at every age. And yet, you might still believe you need to stay composed to be worthy of staying in their life. That belief is the old system running in the background. The one that says, if I'm too real, I'll be too much. But connection doesn't actually survive perfection. It survives honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. And somewhere inside you, there's a conflict forming between two instincts. One wants to protect the connection by controlling yourself. The other wants to experience it without constantly managing how it will end. And that internal split is where most of the emotional tension lives. Not in what they're doing, not in what you're doing, but in what you're not allowing yourself to fully feel yet. And if you sit with that honestly for a moment, you might notice something subtle underneath it all. It's not just fear of losing them, it's fear of being fully known while they're still here. There's a specific kind of fear that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come in as panic. It comes in as hesitation. You're in a conversation with them, and everything is fine on the surface. But internally, you start editing yourself mid-thought. You stop a sentence halfway. You choose a safer version of what you really meant. You laugh a little earlier than you need to. And if someone asked you why you're doing it, you probably couldn't explain it clearly. Because it doesn't feel like fear, it feels like awareness. But it's actually something more delicate than that. It's the awareness of emotional consequence. When someone younger attaches deeply to you, especially for the first time in a way that feels meaningful to them, it can quietly activate a protective reflex in you. Not because they are fragile, but because you remember what emotional intensity can turn into when it's not grounded. You've seen attachment become expectation. You've seen admiration turn into pressure. You've seen closeness turn into confusion when reality doesn't match the emotional image someone built in their mind. So you start scanning for early signs of imbalance, and in doing that, you also start holding yourself slightly back. But here's the subtle part most men miss. That restraint doesn't actually make the connection safer, it just makes it less real. And the younger person, even if they can't articulate it, feels the gap. They feel when you're not fully there, not physically, emotionally. And that creates a strange dynamic where they try harder to reach you, while you try harder not to overextend. Two people moving in opposite emotional directions without intending to. And I want you to notice something carefully here, because this is where misunderstanding often grows quietly. You might think you're protecting them from disappointment, but what you may actually be doing is protecting yourself from vulnerability. Because vulnerability, in this context, isn't about sharing trauma or confessing deep secrets. It's much simpler. It's letting yourself be emotionally impacted without immediately managing the outcome. And that's uncomfortable for men who have learned that emotional stability equals control. So instead, you become observant, measured, thoughtful, but slightly less available in the moments where emotional spontaneity would normally exist. And the younger person interprets that in their own way. Sometimes they think they did something wrong. Sometimes they think they need to try harder. Sometimes they just feel a quiet confusion they can't name. And that's where emotional misalignment begins, not from lack of care, but from too much internal management on one side. But I want to bring your attention to something even deeper. Because beneath all of this interaction pattern, there is usually a more personal truth sitting underneath. It's not just about them, it's about what they awaken in you. When someone younger genuinely connects with you, it can bring forward a version of yourself you thought you had already outgrown. Not the immature version, the unarmored version, the one that still hoped connection could be simple. Before you learned to calculate emotional risk, before you started anticipating disappointment before it arrived. And that version of you doesn't feel weak, it feels exposed. And exposure is something most men confuse with danger, so you tighten up. But here's the quiet contradiction. The parts of you that feel most alive in this connection are usually the parts you've been avoiding in yourself for years. The parts that don't negotiate every feeling. The parts that don't immediately turn emotion into strategy. And that's why this dynamic feels so psychologically intense. Because it's not just about attraction or age or circumstance, it's about emotional reactivation. Something in you is being brought back online, something you thought was no longer accessible, and that creates both warmth and instability. Not because anything is wrong, but because your internal system is not used to operating in that emotional frequency anymore. So you oscillate between openness and caution, between curiosity and control, between allowing the connection to happen and quietly trying to predict where it leads. And in that oscillation, the connection itself becomes something you start analyzing instead of experiencing. But emotional connection doesn't survive long under constant analysis. It needs presence, even imperfect presence. And the hardest truth here is this: you can't fully control how someone experiences you while also being fully present with them. At some point, you have to choose where your attention lives. In managing perception, or in actually being there. And most men don't realize they've made a choice until they feel the distance growing silently between them and someone they genuinely care about. At some point, you start noticing something you didn't expect. The connection doesn't feel like it's getting bigger anymore. It feels like it's getting more sensitive. Small things matter more than they should. A delayed reply, a change in tone, a moment where you didn't explain yourself fully. And suddenly, you're aware that you're being emotionally read in real time. Not judged, read. There's a difference. And it changes how you move through the interaction. You start becoming slightly more intentional than natural. You think before you speak, not in a healthy, reflective way, but in a protective way. And here's the quiet shift that happens without warning. You begin treating emotional connection like something that can be optimized, as if you say the right thing, at the right time, in the right emotional tone, you can maintain stability. But real connection doesn't respond to optimization, it responds to authenticity, even messy authenticity, especially messy authenticity. And yet, many men in your position start doing something subtle. They try to become the safe version of themselves. Not dishonest, just carefully curated. And the younger person, depending on their emotional awareness, will either lean into that safety or slowly start feeling like something is missing. Not because you changed into someone else, but because you stopped letting certain parts of yourself exist in the space between you. And I want to pause here, because this is where a lot of misunderstandings form in these dynamics. You might think the goal is to be consistent, predictable, emotionally stable at all times. But emotional intimacy doesn't actually grow from predictability alone. It grows from emotional truth that can survive unpredictability. There's a difference between being grounded and being emotionally edited. One feels secure. The other feels slightly distant, even if it looks stable on the surface. And sometimes, without realizing it, you may start leaning into stability so much that the emotional texture of the connection flattens. Not intentionally, just as a form of self-protection. Because unpredictability used to cost you something in the past, So now you try to remove it before it appears. But here's what's psychologically interesting. The younger person isn't necessarily looking for perfection. They're looking for emotional presence. They want to feel you when you're there, not just interact with you when you're composed. And when that presence becomes less consistent, they don't always withdraw immediately. Sometimes they try to bridge the gap. They ask deeper questions. They share more of themselves. They become more emotionally expressive. Not because something is wrong, but because they're trying to restore emotional contact. And if you're not careful, that's where things can start to feel like pressure. Not because they're demanding too much, but because you've started holding too much internally. You're managing your side of the emotional exchange so carefully that any additional emotional input starts to feel heavier than it actually is. And that's when men often make a quiet mistake. They start believing the connection is becoming too intense, when in reality what's happening is their internal space for emotional flow has become too restricted. So everything feels amplified. But it's not the emotion that increased, it's the container that shrank. And this is where honesty with yourself matters more than control. Because if you misread that moment, you might start pulling away. Not dramatically, just subtly. Less availability, shorter responses, more emotional distance disguised as being busy or needing space. And to the other person, it doesn't feel like logic. It feels like disappearance. Not physical disappearance, emotional withdrawal. And that shift changes the entire tone of the connection. Because now they're not just relating to you. They're trying to regain access to you. And you're trying to manage how much access is appropriate. And neither side is necessarily wrong, but both sides are now operating from different emotional assumptions. One is trying to connect more deeply, the other is trying to protect emotional equilibrium, and that's where things can quietly drift, even without conflict. Not because love wasn't real, but because emotional regulation replaced emotional presence. And if there's one truth sitting underneath all of this, it's simple but uncomfortable. You can't fully protect yourself from emotional intensity without also reducing emotional intimacy. They are connected, and somewhere in that tension, you start realizing something you didn't expect when this began. It was never just about being chosen, it was about what you would have to allow yourself to feel once you were.